Hey, what's up? It's Soup here, and welcome to my Kyrian Arcane Mage class guide. This guide is going to go over everything I think you need to know to succeed as Kyrian Arcane. If you're looking for specific information, then feel free to check the timestamps in the description and skip ahead. Alright, it's a lot to go over, so let's get started. First and foremost, how exactly does Kyrian Arcane work? Let's start with the Legendary. This guide is going to focus solely on the Arcane Harmony Legendary. You want to make this legendary as gloves and put crit and mastery on it. Arcane Harmony causes each tick of arcane missiles to buff your next barrage by 8%, stacking 18 times. This means Arcane is very much a ramp class and requires pre-planning to effectively use cooldowns. I'll get into cooldown management later in this guide. Radiant Spark is the Kyrian Covenant ability for mages. It has a 30-second cooldown and applies a dot to your target that also buffs the damage of your next 5 direct damage spells, increasing in 10% increments from 0 to 40% as seen in this graphic. It's important to note that the damage buff duration can show differently than the dot duration as shown in this clip. Once you cast your first direct damage spell after Radiant Spark, you have 8 seconds to cast the rest. If the dot duration ends first, then the damage buff will end with it. This is unlikely to affect your gameplay, but it's worth being aware of. The next major component of how this build works is the way Barrage damage snapshots. Arcane Barrage seems to determine its damage the moment it gets casted. By spamming Barrage at the end of an Arcane Blast cast, you're able to queue it up and snapshot the Barrage damage with the 40% spark damage buff, even though Arcane Blast has no travel time. Anytime you're able to include an Arcane Blast with Barrage into the 40% damage buff, you should, assuming they both fit into Magi. I'll get more into that later. And then something I've really been enjoying about this playstyle is the cadence it follows. You generate arcane charges by casting Arcane Blast, Explosion, or Orb. It's important to become familiar with how much time it takes to build big barrages in order to decide when to hold barrage stacks or to dump them and build back. A normal arcane missiles cast will give you 5 stacks, and a clear casting proc will give you 8. In between cooldowns on single target with 15% haste, my average time to build from no arcane charges and no barrage stacks to 4 charges and 18 stacks without any clear casting procs is about 15 seconds. Arcane Missiles is a 2.2 second channel, meaning I need a minimum of 8 seconds to safely channel missiles to get to 18 stacks leading up to a Magi ramp. The goal is to find the sweet spot of not holding 18 barrage stacks for too long without forcing yourself to hold Magi or Arcane Power because you have to build stacks. Alright, next, one of the most frustrating aspects of this build, Barrage Cleave. To understand the importance of this, let's look at the Resonance talent. This talent causes every target you cleave with Barrage to increase the damage of Barrage by 15%. This means if you can include 4 cleave targets during Magi, your single target funnel gets a 60% damage buff. The struggle with this is that Barrage doesn't cleave intelligently. It seems to cleave from the center of an enemy hitbox, not the edge. So what this means is that bosses with very large hitboxes, for example Eye of the Jailer, are extremely tricky or outright impossible to cleave Barrage off of. This also factors into Barrage travel time during Magi, but more on that in a sec. So far, I'm finding that the single most important thing you can do to perform well in this build is find ways to include Barrage Cleave during Magi. And then the next thing is getting the most out of Magi. The best thing you can do here is pre-position. Being able to get within 10 yards of your target will give you the most room to get your full ramp out. I use Theomara's range check weak aura that's in the description to help remind me when I'm just too far and I have to skip the final Arcane Blast. But as a general rule, just try to be as close to your target as you can before starting your ramp. It's much more important to get Barrage to hit during Magi than to get the final Arcane Blast off. If you're unsure if you can make it, just skip the blast and send the Barrage. Alright, quick note on Trinkets. I think that either the Unbound Changeling with a crit proc from Mists or the Forbidden Necromantic Tome from Kel'Thuzad are ideal passive trinkets, and the Soul Editing Ruby is a must-have. I know that IQD sims well and would line up better than a 2-minute trinket when running Pelagos, but in our recent Soul Render kill, one of our healers sucked up 13k mana from multiple IQDs, so I'm content sticking with Ruby. Also, the way I use Ruby when I run Pelagos is I just hold it until my next Arcane Power, which lines back up with Berserking. Alright, let's move on to talents. On the first row, this build plays Amplification. This, in addition to the extra missile from clearcasting procs, is why you get 8 barrage stacks from clearcasting and 5 stacks from a normal cast. This next row will come down to personal preference. I've never played Shimmer as Arcane, and so far I have yet to find a specific use for Shimmer that I think would outweigh the value I get from Slipstream. I will go more into how I utilize Slipstream later in this guide, though. For the next row, Rune of Power is an auto pick. I've never attempted to play this build without Rune, but I don't think it's viable. The next row is Resonance. This is another auto pick. It is the foundation of how Kyrian Arcane plays. And then the next row is a utility row. I run Chrono Shift in most of the raid, and then Ring of Frost in keys, and I'll probably be running Ring of Frost on Kel'Thuzad. And then Arcane Orb, yet another auto pick. The way this ability works is very similar to Frozen Orb, but it doesn't stop traveling for the full 40 yards unless it hits a pebble or a wall. First thing to note is be careful which way you shoot this. I've ninja pulled multiple extra trash packs with Orb and Mythic Plus. Second, Orb generates 1 arcane charge when cast, and each time it deals damage. This means that it is possible to generate more than 4 arcane charges if there are more than 4 targets and they're spread far enough out. I wouldn't say this has any major impact on playstyle, but still worth being aware of. The last talent is Overpowered, also an auto pick. This talent plus Resonance make arcane power a very large part of your overall damage. And then on to Soulbinds. This build can play effectively with both Pelagos and Clea. Starting with Pelagos, the main benefits are the mastery you get from combat meditation, having access to 3 potency conduit slots, which allows you to use Arcane Prodigy conduit for arcane power cooldown reduction, and the last trait, Newfound Resolve, that randomly gives you a 10% main stat and stamina buff. The main reason I choose Pelagos over Clea is when I can use arcane power on cooldown effectively. It is recommended to track the combat meditation internal cooldown with a weak aura, and I've included that in the description. The main benefits from Clea are crit, crit, and more crit. Literally 3 sources of crit buffs. Since Arcane Mage plays in melee and AoE situations when possible, the stacking crit from Pointed Courage is pretty consistent. You also consistently get the 3% crit from Spear of the Archon in any situation where ads spawn or on every trash pack and keys. And then the last trait, Light the Path, gives you crit through Valiant Strikes. I choose to use Clea when it's advantageous to hold arcane power for at least 2 minutes, such as on Soul Render in the raid. Most amazing aspect of all the crit you get from Clea is that all of it is straight percentage increase, not secondary stat rating. The reason this matters is because it bypasses the diminishing returns that Blizzard added to secondary stats for Shadowlands. Next, I'll go over conduits. The potency conduits used in this build are Magi's Brand, Ire of the Ascended, and Arcane Prodigy. Use all 3 when running Pelagos, and only Magi's Brand and Ire of the Ascended when running Clea. It's also important to note that if you have Evocation up, you can fish for arcane power cooldown reduction by spending mana. This sometimes means I spam cast arcane missiles and clip the cast every global for the sake of spending mana. For my finesse conduit, I always choose Flow of Time. And for endurance conduits, I use Diverted Energy and Tempest Barrier with Pelagos, and additionally Condensed Animosphere with Clea. Alright, moving on to stat priorities. The stat priority for this build is crit equals mastery over versatility over haste. I'm not entirely sure what the ideal secondary stat distribution is for this build yet. Here are my current secondary stats and stat weights for 1 target 5-minute patchwork sim. I originally thought that 30% mastery would be the target, but as you can see from this, that even with 26.8% mastery, my stat weights are pushing me towards versatility. I'm currently following the stat weights to see how it goes. Here's my personal take on secondary stats. For mastery, I think just having enough mastery to not have any mana problems is the goal, and I'd say at least 25% is probably enough. And then for crit, I'm looking forward to stacking as much crit as I can eventually, but it's worth noting that your crit rating will hit diminishing returns when you use Soul Editing Ruby. Stat weights have been pushing me away from crit since I got over 25% though. And then for versatility, versatility is always a great defensive stat, which Arcane can benefit from given the lack of mobility. I don't know for sure whether Verse is a better offensive stat than Mastery, but Sims have been pushing me away from Mastery lately, especially in AoE situations. And then haste. This is the big question for this build. On paper, the ideal amount of haste is 10%. I've tried to play with 10% and I find it almost unplayable in real situations. I have been playing between 13 and 16% haste, and I much prefer it. With Blink on the global when using Slipstream and how frequently I end up having to move during Arcane Power, I view haste as a somewhat utility stat because it gives me more room for latency or movement during cooldowns. The other aspect is that more haste means you can cast from further away due to Barrage travel time. Alright, on to Arcane Mage Defensives. Arcane, and Kyrian Arcane especially, is a very unforgiving way to play Mage. By this, I mean your mobility is significantly hindered with the loss of either Door of Shadows or Soul Shape, and the loss of spammable filler spells. I will go into how to manage movement in more detail later, but what this means is you need to be on top of using your defensive cooldowns. Thankfully, Arcane has amazing defensives. First is Prismatic Barrier, which gives you a 20% magic damage reduction as long as the shield holds, and a 35% reduction on the duration of incoming magic debuffs. This is incredibly strong against large single hits of magic damage that occur in many raid and dungeon boss fights. I suggest keeping an eye out for opportunities to hold barrier to reduce these large hits. Next is Greater Invisibility. This is quite possibly the best part of playing Arcane. Having a Feign Death that's also 20 seconds of Invis and 60% damage reduction on a 2-minute cooldown seems too good to be true. And then an important note is while the magic damage reduction from mirror images plus barrier plus Invis adds up to 100%, this doesn't actually negate 100% of magic damage taken. I tested this on the Titanic Death Gaze on Eye of the Jailer, and 100% magic damage reduction was actually 77.81% damage reduction. And lastly, as Kyrian, you have access to Kyrian File, which removes all types of debuffs except magic and heals you for 20% HP. This makes for a great extra potion and can be very strong for fights like the last boss in Plaguefall or Sylvanas Phase 1. Okay, now that we've gone over the foundation of this build, let's get into how all of this comes together. Starting with a single target rotation. The core of this rotation is 5 Arcane Blasts and an 18 stack Barrage. If you're using Arcane Power, then you start with Radiant Spark into Touch of the Magi into Arcane Power and whatever racials you have. Outside of Arcane Power, you cast Rune of Power into Spark, then into Magi. After the big Barrage during Arcane Power, you will have time to buff another Barrage. On single target, I've had good results with casting Orb after Barrage and then using the remainder of the Rune of Power buff to cast missiles and then snapshot a 2-charge Barrage right before the rune buff ends. Outside of cooldowns, I try to build 18 stacks for every Barrage. Next is AOE Rotation. The AOE Rotation during cooldowns takes priority at 4+ targets and outside of cooldowns at 3+ targets. The opener is still either Spark, Magi, Arcane Power, or Rune, Spark, Magi. The main AoE rotation for the biggest damage output is Arcane Explosion twice, Barrage, Arcane Orb, then Arcane Blast into Barrage. I've also been trying out pairing shorter cooldowns in Mythic Plus when I have to hold Magi and Arcane Power for a pull coming up. If starting with 0 Arcane charges, you cast Rune, then Spark, Orb, Arcane Explosion 3 times, then Blast Barrage. If starting with 2 Arcane charges, you cast Rune, Spark, Arcane Explosion twice, Barrage, Orb, Blast Barrage. And then the AoE rotation outside of cooldowns is Arcane Explosion to build up to 4 charges, then Barrage. Only cast missiles with clear casting procs below 7 targets, and ditch missiles altogether at 7+. I personally also like to build Barrage stacks when Orb is coming off cooldown soon on 3 or more targets. Moving on to cooldown management. This build is not an uptime playstyle. It is a ramp and cooldown timing playstyle. First thing I want to go over is pre-positioning. Knowing the fights and having your cooldowns planned as much as possible will help prevent having to move during your Magi ramps. And if you have to ramp during movement, then plan to have presence of mind ready. Secondly, I can't emphasize enough how importantly cleaving ads during Magi is. Knowing when ads will spawn to include them in boss funnel is one of the trickiest and most rewarding parts of this build. Fights like Fate Scribe or the 3rd boss in Plaguefall are examples of where lining cooldowns up with ad spawns leads to massive extra boss damage. The time it takes to reach the final barrage during your ramp will vary based on your haste levels, so it's important to be aware of when exactly you need to barrage to include cleave and start the ramp soon enough to line that up. And lastly, given that holding Magi for add cleave can be a single target damage gain, looking for opportunities to use shorter cooldowns that would otherwise be wasted is a good idea. This playstyle takes some getting used to because you will have downtime between cooldowns and will be spamming arcane missiles often. But just remember, whenever you can include cleave into your ramp, you should attempt to. Next, I want to go over how I handle movement. Because this build plays with low haste, the margin for error once you begin a Magi ramp is very small. If you have to use your cooldowns when there's movement coming up, then make sure you save presence of mind to help protect your casts. As you can see in this clip, I cast one Arcane Blast, then I used presence of mind to let me reposition for the next 3 blasts, then finish the 5th blast into Barrage. You also want to get in the habit of using Fire Blast during movement because Arcane doesn't have a spammable filler spell, and you can't use Barrage as filler if you're pooling stacks for upcoming cooldowns. Another good filler if you run Slipstream is Arcane Explosion to fish for clear casting procs so you can keep casting missiles while moving. This is also great if you need to get arcane power back faster when running Pelagos. And then I want to make a case for Slipstream over Shimmer. The primary benefit I find from Slipstream is protecting clear casting missiles and allowing for repositioning while channeling. And as previously stated, this allows for stacking barrage damage and getting arcane power cooldown reduction during heavy movement. The ability to never have to cancel Evocate is also great. The other part of this for me, mainly in keys, is that I keep finding great uses for the blink stun removal. Just a few examples: the stun on the 3rd boss in Plaguefall, the overgrowth stun from the villagers in Mists, and the stun on the 1st boss in Theater of Pain. I will be making a short video focusing specifically on all of the places the blink stun removal gains value like that, but the point is I find Slipstream's mobility to be adequate in all content so far, and I value protecting 100% of clear casting procs higher than being able to shimmer while casting. I also find a stop casting macro makes blink on the global feel a lot more responsive, and you can find that macro in the description. A quick note regarding Domination Shards. The Unholy set still sims the best for me, and I'm finding that if you pay close attention to it, you can sometimes line up the big Unholy proc with Arcane Power. Because of this, I think the Unholy set is still going to continue to be the play. And last, I want to go over some specific tips and tricks I've found helpful so far. First is fishing for clear casting procs before raid boss pulls. With clear casting giving you 8 barrage stacks, being able to start with a proc potentially saves you an entire global before starting your ramp. Next is arcane missile clipping. I've been able to clip non-clear casting missiles before the last tick without losing any missiles by watching my LVY cast bar. I don't use any cast bar weak auras or anything to specifically track this, and I haven't been able to make it work on the tail end of clear casting procs, but I'm not sure how big of a gain it is to do this often aside from rushing barrage stacks for an upcoming ramp. And then something to keep in mind when running Slipstream is that arcane missiles will continue to channel if you face away or run out of line of sight. They will even finish channeling when further than 40 yards away, but it seems to cancel the cast when you get to about 50 or 60 yards. And lastly, I suggest everyone make a Mouseover macro for slow. I've included that in the description. Given the lack of hard crowd control in the Arcane Toolkit, the fact that slow can be cast in any direction similar to Counterspell makes it very easy to use and very helpful for kiting situations. All right, that's going to be it for this guide. I want to sincerely thank everyone for watching. I know it's a lot of information, but I really hope it helps improve your gameplay. I'm also working on a series of short videos specifically focusing on Mythic Plus as well, and I welcome everyone watching to join my Discord with the link in the description below, and let me know in the YouTube short request channel if there are any topics you'd like me to cover. As always, if you enjoyed the video or learned something, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments or join my Discord and ask there. You can also find information about one-on-one coaching in my Discord. Thank you again for watching, and I hope everyone is enjoying Kyrian Arcane as much as I am, because I'm finding this to be an incredibly fun and challenging way to play Mage. See you on the next one. Peace.